Shekhenim, chapter 10:1. A tree should be planted at least 25 cubits away from the city. A carob tree and a wild fig tree should be planted at least 50 cubits away. These measures were instituted for the aesthetic appearance of the city. When a tree is found within these distances, it should be cut down. If the tree was planted before the city expanded with present size, the inhabitants of the city must pay the owner for his tree. If there is a doubt concerning the matter and it is not known which came first, the owner of the tree is not reimbursed. Instead, he must take his tree and depart. 2. A significantly large threshing floor should be separated from the city at least 50 cubits, so that the wind will not carry the straw when the produce is winnowed and cause it to harm the inhabitants of the city. Similarly, a person should not make a significantly large threshing floor within his own property unless he owns 50 cubits around it in all directions, so that the straw does not damage his colleague's plants or a field that he has left fallow. 3. Animal carcasses, graves, and leather works must be situated at least 50 cubits away from the city. 4. Leather work should be positioned only to the east of the city, because the east wind is warm and minimizes the harm caused by the odor of the leather-making process. 5. The following principles apply when a person intends to soak flax near a vegetable garden belonging to his colleague, in which instance the water used for soaking would be absorbed by the earth and damage the vegetables. Or he plants leeks near the onions belonging to a colleague, in which instance the flavor of the onions will be weakened. Or he plants mustard next to a beehive, in which instance the bees will eat the leaves and the honey will be spoiled. The person's actions will cause damage. It is not required to make a separation so that damage does not take place. Instead, it is the person whose property will be damaged who must distance his crops if he wishes that the damage not occur. For the other person is performing his activity in his own property, the damage occurs on its own, as it were. When do we say that he does not have to keep a distance? When damage comes about by itself after the person whose deeds caused damage ceases his activity. When or the act that this person performs in his own domain caused damage to his colleague's property at the time he is performing the action, he is considered to have damaged the property of his hands. What can that be likened to? A person who is standing in his own property and shooting arrows into his neighbors and saying, "What's the problem? I'm acting in my own property." Certainly such a person should be prevented from causing damage. With regard to all the instances above where a separation was required, if the person does not make a required separation, he is considered to have caused damage with his arrows. Therefore, one must make a separation of 3 handbreadths or slightly more between soaking flax and vegetables, leeks, onions, mustard, and bees, so that one will not be considered as having caused damage to one's own actions. It is, however, not necessary to make a separation great enough to prevent damage from occurring on its own accord. 6. The following must apply when the owner of the second story pours out water on his floor and descends into the room below him. If there was a plaster between the ceiling and the floor on which the water could collect at the time it was poured, so that the owner of the upper story had completed pouring his water, it would be absorbed. Only later would it descend to the lower dwelling. It is the responsibility of the owner of the lower dwelling to correct the situation and prevent damage from occurring to him. If there was no plaster there, immediately when the water was poured out, it would descend. The owner of the upper story is considered to be caused damage with his arrows. He is required either to fix the flooring or refrain from pouring water. Similar laws apply in all analogous situations. 7. Following was applied when a person has a tree growing in his own field, but in the nearest system belonging to a colleague. The owner of the system may not lodge a complaint against the protestant that the roots of your tree enter into my system and destroy the rationale that the damage comes about as a matter of course, and at a later time. At the time he planted it, it did not cause any damage. As the owner of the system may dig within his own property, so too the owner of the tree may plant within his own property. Similarly, if Reuben dug a cistern and found the roots of the tree belonging to his neighbor Shimon in the field, he may cut them off and dig deeper. It was belonged to him. If he dug within 16 cubits of Shimon's tree which belonged to Shimon, he may cut them off, but must give them to him. The following must apply if he does not have to dig a cistern. The roots of Shimon's tree grow in the field. He should dig down 3 handbreadths amount of space necessary to prevent the plow from being impeded. He may cut off any roots that is within these 3 handbreadths. He need not be concerned that perhaps this will cause his colleague's trees to dry out, for he is digging with his own property. 8. The following must apply when a field belonging to a person's neighbor was planted with vines or trees, and the person decides to plant vines in the field next to those vines and trees next to those trees. He must distance these 4 cubits from those. When is the double planet? So on the asphalt country is required to separate only 2 cubits between vines and trees, or between 2 sets of trees. However, a 4 cubit separation is required in every land. If there was a fence between 2 properties in any land, both neighbors may plant to the edge of the fence. When a tree belonging to a person's neighbor is leaning into that person's field, he may cut to the height of the goad that is on the plow. With regard to a carob tree and a wild fig tree, cut down all the branches until the branches are even with the property line. Similarly, if any tree is planted near a parched field or orchard, the owner may cut down all the branches belonging to the neighbor until the branches are even with the property line. Chapter 11:1. When a person makes a threshing floor within his own property, he establishes a lantern, a place to perform work that can create dust, dirt, or the like. He must distance the place of his activity far enough that the dirt, the odor of the lantern, or the dust does not damage his colleague and cause him damage, even if the wind that brings dirt, loose strands of flax or chaff, or the like generated when he performs his activity to the colleague's premises. He must separate himself so that it does not reach colleague's property and cause damage even when it was caused by an ordinary wind. For all these situations can be likened to causing damage with one's arrows. 2. Even though a person is obligated to make such a separation, if ordinary wind carried the chaff or the dirt and caused damage, the person performing the activity is not liable for the wind. The influence that caused damage did not come about because of the force of the person whose acts led to the damage. 3. When someone crushes goats or the like in his own property, but when he beats them, his colleague is joining courtyard shakes to the extent that a cover falls off a jug. He is considered to have caused damage with his arrows. Must move either fall off away that the courtyard does not shake, or must cease to take tasks that cause the damage. Moreover, if he causes damage when the courtyard shakes, he is liable to pay because the damage came from his force. 4. The following principles apply with regard to all the required separations mentioned in the previous chapter. If the person who was required to separate failed to do so, and the neighbor saw the disturbing fact and yet remained silent, he is considered to have waived his right to protest. He may not raise a protest later to require him to move. Above applies, provided it is obvious that he waived his right. For instance, he immediately helped his colleague in performing the activity. He told him to do so, or saw him perform his activity next to him and remained silent, did not take issue with him. The general principle is whenever a person establishes a right to perform a damaging activity, the right is entrenched as his own, as has been established. When does it apply? When he establishes the right to perform any damaging activity, with the exception of the aforementioned in this chapter, smoke, the odor of the latrine, dust and the like, and the shaking of the ground. With regard to these activities, one can never establish his right to perform them, even if the person suffering from damage remains silent for several years and come to force his neighbor to distance himself. Similar concepts also apply with regard to the invasion of privacy in places where it is required to build a petition. He may compel him to build a petition wherever he desires to explain. Why are these damaging factors different from all other damaging factors? Because a person's disposition will never be willing to bear these damaging activities, and we assume that he has not waived the right to protest for the damages and ongoing nature of it. However, Kenya was concluded confirming that he waives his right to protest the activities he may not retract. 5. The term will apply with regard to a person who is establishing himself in a profession involving blood, animal carcasses, and the like on his premises, and ravens and other birds of that type come because of the blood and eat. While doing so, they cause discomfort to the person's neighbor because of the sound of their chirping with the blood in their feet. They sit in the neighbor's trees and soil his produce. If the neighbor is irritable or sick, the chirping of the birds harms him, and the produce is spoiled because of the blood. The person performing the tax must separate to the extent that his neighbor does not suffer any harm because of him. For this type of harm is comparable to the odor of the latrine and the like, which one can never establish the right to perform a task. Similarly, if one of the inhabitants of a lane or quarry become a craftsman, the other inhabitants did not protest, he establishes his right to practice his profession. Nevertheless, there are people constantly coming in and out to purchase his wares. Despite the fact that neighbors remain silent, the customer does not establish his right to have his customers enter at any time. Neighbors can put this say can't sleep because of all the people coming in and out, for this damage is an ongoing nature, like smoke or dust. The Ga'inim ruled in this fashion. 6. Following was employing a person is known to have exercised the privilege that encourages upon a colleague in a situation where the establishment of the rights to the privilege will be recognized. For instance, he opened a window overlooking his neighbor's property, diverted the direction of an irrigation ditch, or did not distance himself from the neighbor's property to the extent required. The person who established the right to his neighbor, you told me to do this, you waived the right to the protest against me after you saw what I did, or the encroachment against your property was recognized, and yet you remained silent and did not protest against me. The person whose rights were encroached, by contrast, claims, this is the first time I saw it. I did not know of it before, and when I saw it, I protested against you, and you told me I will distance myself, or I will close it, and you are continuously deferring me so that you can establish your rights to the privilege. In all claims that is of similar nature, it is the responsibility of the person whose rights were encroached to bring proof of his claim. If he does not bring proof, the person whose actions encroached upon his colleague may take a short hesitation and depart. 7. Different was when a person is known to have exercised the privilege that encroaches upon a colleague in a situation where his establishment of the right to this privilege would not be recognized. For instance, producing smoke, the foul over latrine, and like if the person encroaching on his colleague claims that he established a kingdom with his neighbor with regard to this privilege, it is the responsibility of the person encroaching upon his colleague to prove that a kingdom was indeed performed. If he cannot disprove the neighbor's right to encroach, must take a short hesitation that he never entered a kingdom with regard to this matter. Afterwards, the person who encroached upon a colleague must move the disturbance. 12. The following was applied when brothers or partners came to divide a field, with each taking a portion of the field was all of equal value, without one place being better or another worse, but instead was all the same. The field is divided by measure. If one of the partners saying, "Me my portion on this side, so that it'll be close to another field which I own, so that there will be a large field." His request is heeded, and we compel the other partner to grant this privilege. For holding back in such a situation would be a reflection of the trait of disdain. If whoever one portion was higher quality than the other, close to the river or to a path, and the two portions were evaluated, the good being equivalent to the bad, and one of the partners asked that he be granted a portion of a particular side. With not his request, instead they received their portions by lot. If one of them said, "Give me only half the measure of the entire property, although I am be given for the lower quality portion without the field being evaluated," you can receive the half of higher quality, and you can receive the half of higher quality, so that my portion will be closer to the field. Some Ga'inim rules request is heeded. My conception leans towards this conclusion. It is appropriate to rule in this manner. 2. When a first participates in the division of property, is granted both his shares together whenever a Yavam, the right of his father's estate with his brothers. He is allotted both his portion and his brother's portion by lottery. If he is allotted both of these portions together, this is allotment. If he is allotted them in separate places, this is allotment. 3. When the property is surrounded by a river on its east and north side, and path on its south and west sides is divided on a diagonal. This way, each person receives access to the river and a path. If one partner is requested to give me my portion on this side, because this is next to my field. This request is heeded. The general principle is whenever there is a matter which provides benefit to one party but does not cause a colleague a loss at all, we compel the colleague to comply. 4. When one of a group of brothers or partners sells his portion to another individual, the other brothers or partners may remove that individual from his purchase. They must pay him the price he paid, but he must depart. This privilege is granted to the prevent a foreign party from entering among them. 5. This is not the limit of this principle. Even when a person sells property which he owns to another person, his colleague or the owner of the property neighboring his, the right to pay the purchase price to the buyer and remove him from his purchase. The purchaser comes from afar, considered as the agent of the neighbor. This applies whether the original owner's agent conducted the sale or whether the property was being sold by the court. The property was sold to the court. The privilege of the neighbor is granted, even if the purchaser was a Torah scholar, a non-immediate neighbor, a relative of the seller. Although the neighbor was an unlearned person with no family connections to the seller, the neighbor receives priority, may remove the purchase. Practice stemming from the charge. You shall do what is just and good. A sage said, since the sale is fundamentally the same, it is just and good that the property should be acquired by the neighbor instead of the person living farther away. If there are many neighbors, all have a right to acquire the property which was sold. It is divided among them equally according to their number, and they all must reimburse the buyer for the purchase price. This applies provided they all come at the same time. Whoever one comes purchases the property from the buyer, he alone acquires it, for his neighbor similarly. If the neighbors come and purchase it, and others are in a distant country, those who are present are entitled to purchase it and it becomes theirs. Similarly, if a person sells a property to one neighbor or one of his business partners, even if he is not a partner in the ownership of the land and property, that person acquires it. The other partners or neighbors who do not have a right to acquire it together with them. 6. When a person sells his property to one person, a person whose property borders on one of the fields that were sold does not have the right to displace the purchaser from that field before he purchased it and the other fields at once. Similarly, when a person sells a field to his original owners or when he purchases it from a Gentile, the neighbor is not given the right to purchase it. 7. When a person sells property to a Gentile, the seller is placed under a ban of ostracism until he accepts responsibility for any loss the Gentile might cause his neighbors, and the Gentile agrees to conduct himself in relation to all matters according to the Jewish law. Neighbors according to Jewish law, all matters. If the Gentile compels a neighbor to accept a loss for which he would not be responsible according to Jewish law, the seller is compelled to make a restitution. 8. The rights of a neighbor do not apply with regard to the rental of property. 9. When a person designates a property as security and afterwards sells it to the person whom he has designated as security, the neighbor should not give up the right to displace the neighbor should not give him the right to displace the purchaser. Similarly, the neighbor should not give him the right to displace the purchaser when a person sells a property because it's located far from him. Because it's located far from him in order to purchase another that is located closer. When the seller sold the less valuable property in order to use the proceeds of the sale to purchase a more valuable one, when he sold the property to pay tax to the king, when the property was sold to pay the burial expenses to the support of the owner's widow or daughter, instead the purchaser acquires the property. 10. One of the neighbors not given the right to displace the purchaser. For in all these situations, the seller is very anxious to sell the property, and he is selling it because of dire need. If the neighbors were given the right to displace the purchaser, no one will ever be willing to purchase property from the purchaser. Will say, why should himself to purchase his property so that the neighbors will come and displace me, and the seller will not be able to wait until the neighbor brings money and purchase it. 11. Following was applied when the purchaser claims that the seller sold the property to him because he was pressed for funds to pay for a tax or the like, and the neighbor claims that he is lying and fabricating a story in order to nullify his right. The neighbor is responsible for proving his claim. Only then can he expropriate the property from the purchaser. If the neighbor does not prove his claim, the purchaser must support his claim if the Shavuos has his 12. Even if the purchaser does not have a definite claim concerning the matter, the purchaser cannot be compelled to relinquish his purchase unless the neighbor brings clear-cut proof. Even if the purchaser claims you have stolen the field that you claim to be your own, you are merely a sharecropper or renter received that as security. The neighbor must prove that he is a neighbor, that he establishes the right to the claim he alleges to own. Similar must apply in all analogous situations. 13. When a person sells property to orphans below the age of maturity, the neighbor is not given the right to displace the purchaser for goodness and justice, is to act generously towards such individuals more than a neighbor. 14. Similarly, when a person sells property to a woman, the neighbor is not given the right to displace the purchaser. No rationale that it is not customary for women to trouble themselves so frequently to purchase property. Hence, since a woman did make such an effort and purchase property, it's an act of kindness to allow her to retain ownership. 15. If property was sold to a neighbor is given the right to displace them because there is a doubt regarding their halachic status. Possibly they may be considered as a woman. 16. The following must apply when the land of a property is owned by one individual and the building or the trees situated upon it is owned by another. If the owner of the building or the trees has privileges regarding the land, each of them is considered to be the other's neighbor. Therefore, if either of them sold his portion, his colleague has the right to displace the purchaser. Different rules apply when, by contrast, the owner of the trees or the building does not have any right to the land, and whenever he desires, the owner of the land until the owner of the trees in the building, uproot your trees or destroy your building. If the owner of the field sells his property, the purchaser acquires his purchase. Neither the owner of the trees nor the owner of the building has the right to displace him. If the owner of the trees or the owner of the building sells his possession, the owner of the land has the right to displace them. 17. The following rules serve as guidelines when a row of date palms, a tall and sturdy building, a potential leg separate between a person's property and the property border of a colleague. We see if it's possible to plant even one row of produce within the intervening entity, so that the two fields will be joined. If so, he is considered a neighbor and has the right to displace the purchaser. If not, he may not displace the purchaser.